The purpose of the roundtable is to have a session in which is not a panel in which people prepare presentations. The purpose of the roundtable is to have a sort of impromptu, just like presentation in which I will introduce the questions and the participants in the roundtable will answer according to how they feel about it, what is the reaction. I will try to promote, as my role here as a moderator, to promote the reaction. And obviously I will have my eye on the audience, which I encourage you to participate. You feel the need to participate. Obviously I will start with the people at the table and with my dear friends, which are in the, this is the composition of this roundtable. The idea of this roundtable came from a previous session we made last fall about Hispanic and Latino journalism, in which we have 5 scholars sitting down in front of 5 professionals of the media. For the first time in years, scholars sat down with professionals to discuss about issues of what Latino journalism and Latino media was. And it worked out very well. I hope that I will have the same luck that I had last October, and that we will have an interesting discussion here again, dynamic and informative. So this time I have 3 lawyers, which are Adolfo Jiménez. I start with Lynn Carrillo, my dear friend Lynn Carrillo. We worked together at University of Miami. With Lynn Carrillo, we met, as well as with Adolfo, in seminars that we participated through the Inter-American Press Association, which was the first time I met Tom Julian as well, who is a supporter and a sponsor. Thank you very much, Tom, for helping us here with this event. So here I have Lynn Carrillo, a lawyer. I have Adolfo Jiménez, a lawyer. And I have my dear friend from the Universidad de los Andes, FIU for a long time, a professor of, in SIPA, School of International Public Affairs, a historian as well, and a professor of the College of Law. And my dear friend is Victor Uribe, a Colombian as well, Cuban, and my dear colleague Cuban as well. And 3 journalists actually. I don't see Emilio. Emilio should be around because he was asking questions. I have Sergio Otálora, a Colombian colleague who is now a journalist in the Diario Las Americas, very well-known journalist in Colombia, working for many years in El Espectador and other media, prestigious media. Please. And then we have Jack Virtue, my next-door colleague in my office, a very experienced journalist, the director of the International Media Center, who has lived practically everywhere in Latin America, in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Mexico, close to live in Colombia, and lived for some years, a couple of years, 3 years in Puerto Rico. And then Emilio Palacio, who is about to sit down here, who is an Ecuadorian journalist from El Universo, well known for the major scandal of the accusations with President Rafael Correa for defamation, and he left the country. By the way, Emilio Palacio was granted as political asylum, as the same thing with Sergio Otálora. My dear friend Sergio was also granted political asylum. Let's get into the subject. And obviously I have my 3 students, 2 of them from the Spanish language program, Mayra Quiróz from Peru, Stephanie Harrisson from Venezuela, and Emily Bello-Pardo, who is in the School of in Political Science, the School of International Public Affairs, right? And the Latin American Master's Program. Both of them, the three of them at the Master's level program. So let's start. I was recently in Quito 3 months ago, and before that, I think that it was in Santiago, Chile. And we were talking about the issue of violence against journalists. It's not that I want to insist on the issue of violence, because when I mention the issue of violence, and we will try to, because this panel is about legal and ethical challenges and opportunities. But let's start with the issue of violence, because the issue of violence poses an interesting legal and as well as an ethical challenge. In those conferences I was mentioning to you in Chile and in Ecuador, I read the numbers of the journalists being killed. 149, 150 journalists killed since 1992, when the Committee to Protect Journalists started counting, which is actually late, right? But Lauria was more eloquent than me about that. 150 journalists being killed. 99 in the last 7 years in Latin America. 69 journalists killed in Mexico. And the interesting thing, or painful thing, is that there is a huge impunity. In Latin America, 69% impunity. 2 out of 3 people killed in Latin America, we never find the perpetrators. But in Latin America, we should feel a little bit better, if you could feel better, because in the world, there is a 9 out of 10 impunity in the world community of journalists. So my question will be here, how can this be connected with the legal issue? Well, the legal issue is that two countries particularly, and Ricardo Trotti from the IAPA knows this very well because he has directed impunity projects for a long time at the IAPA. Colombia and Mexico have created a system of protecting journalists. It has mixed values of how we can create a system, and journalists have denounced that they need to have protection. The question for both lawyers and journalists here at this table is it convenient? Is it necessary? And in the interest of journalists to have official, organized, structured systems of protecting journalists? Should journalists be protected by the government? I give you a little bit of background that during the Uribe administration, President Álvaro Uribe, several journalists that were under protection because of the threats of narco-traffickers and other sources of violence, paramilitary, gangs, official terrorism, army meaning, were complaining that they were being spied on by the same protectors. Now, there is also another interesting discussion of whether or not we should have specialized lawyers who know about communication and are able to understand journalism with a specialized jurisdiction. Should we have special courts? In other words, how can we handle this issue to try to reduce the level of violence, the journalists being killed, and the impunity that exists? By the way, the interesting thing of lawyers is that we have 3 rapporteurs in the world of, in the Organization of American States, rapporteurs for freedom of expression. The 3 of them are fundamentally lawyers, not journalists. Santiago Canton, from 1998 to 2001, an Argentinian, basically a lawyer, human rights lawyer. Eduardo Bertoni, 2001 to 2008, fundamentally a human rights lawyer, superb human rights lawyers, probably the most connected with an association of journalists, Argentinian as well. Catalina Botero, the current rapporteur of freedom of expression, which is going to leave this year, is also a lawyer. And Frank William LaRue from Guatemala is the rapporteur of the United Nations Opinion and Freedom of Expression. So the issue is here, I'm concerned, of the issue of lawyers and journalists. Should journalists be protected? I see that Adolfo has planned to start here.
I guess I just want to comment for a second. I guess you want to make sure you hear me. This is, I think, an area that's very alien to U.S. lawyers that represent media, the idea of safety. Increasingly, when clients call me about questions involving the right to publish or media stories in Latin America, I find myself asking about the journalist's safety, just because it's a real issue. Then the question becomes, is it a legal issue? Is safety, journalism, a journalist's safety a real issue? And I think it is. I mean, it goes to the heart of what journalists do and the heart of the freedom of expression, the concept that these freedoms are protected, not just in the U.S., but across the board through a series of conventions. It's the very basis, the very foundation is legal. It raises some important issues. Should the government, for example, be involved in protecting journalists? It somewhat touches on what the last panel discussed, which is, should journalists be receiving any remuneration, money, benefits from a government? That's a real question, because if your safety depends on a government, is that the right source? Yet, if there isn't a climate of freedom, if that isn't guaranteed, I think it's a real problem. My view is it is provided that safety is done in a way that's completely transparent and insulates the journalist from any kind of influence. It's only what the state should guarantee every single citizen in a country, which is public safety. It's part of the mission, part of what government exists for, which is to guarantee that people can live without fear and in freedom.
And we do have that standard that journalists are no different from regular citizens, and if regular citizens need to receive protection from the state, then journalists as well. But then it poses the issue of the independence. I know many journalists are saying, what is the government doing? What is the business of the government in terms of protecting us? Jack, I see you.
You're right. The concept of government protection is alien.
You want to in the microphone? Thank you.
Is alien to journalists in the United States and in Canada, my home country. The journalist feels beholden to the government if the government is offering special protection to him. The government should be offering special protection to all citizens, not just singling out journalists. The media in Mexico had been one of the most corrupt in the world because so many journalists were receiving payments from the government. You would get if you covered the labor ministry, for instance, you would get a payment from the labor ministry, but in exchange you would be writing a story favorable to the labor ministry. And with about 28 newspapers in Mexico City, you could never tell what was the most important news of the day because so many journalists were were beholden to their beats and were writing articles favoring the people who were paying them. Now, under PAN, the government stopped paying journalists who were covering the presidency. If you were covered the presidency, you received a weekly sobre from the government. So I think if the protection of the journalist is done for local journalists, in many countries, the journalists have to change their mentality. What I'm going to say is just it might not be quite appropriate here, but it says a lot about journalism in Latin America.
Everything appropriate. Don't worry about that, Jack. That's the purpose of this table. Yeah.
The media in Honduras, and quite a bit was spoken about Honduras this morning, has had an oversized role in all aspects of life in the country. Once the top brass of the military invited in 5 top newspaper editors. They were all offered a new Cherokee van. And of course, they were expected to do something to appease the government. 4 of the journalists, of the editors, accepted a van. The 5th rejected it. He wanted a house.
So, Jack, my concern here is that obviously, by the way, and this is in the hemisphere issue that is coming up, we are making an interesting connection between violence and the issue of corruption, too, because, by the way, the source of the violence, of the reason why many of these journalists are being killed, is because they're covering issues of corruption. So, among many things, human rights, corruption, but political corruption as well as regular corruption, including business corruption. So I saw, Sergio, you were making a lot of notes. You have something about, right?
Yeah,
this
protection.
issue?
Protection in Colombia. It's a unique stuff because you have in one hand the government very willing to protect journalism, but on the other hand, you have the backstage, paramilitary supported by the, elements of the state or the government. So you can.
And you know this very well because you were threatened.
You know who is protecting you.
You were threatened yourself, right?
Yeah.
By Carlos Castaño, actually, not a Mickey Mouse game in Colombia or anywhere else, right? So, you know
when I asked protection for the general attorney, he told me, "Oh, what a shame! You have to fled the country." Actually, I can give you some advice. I mean, some official that can give you an advice to protect you by yourself. Some instructions, and that's it. So my alternative was to fled Colombia. I mean, I have no guarantees I had no guarantee at this time to, to exercise journalism. That was
Yes, Victor.
Leonardo, I'm very pragmatic, and I believe that your question is it convenient for journalists to be given protection? In a place like Colombia, even with the many problems that you have in Colombia, including the one you listed, the fact that you might be being checked by the state that is protecting you. In places like Colombia, sometimes there is no alternative. If you want to survive, if you just want to live, you just might have to accept protection in the meantime. It may not be the ideal scenario. It may compromise your independence eventually, but it's a matter of life or death. So either you take protection and you accept the bodyguard that is going to inconvenience your life, not only because he might be spying on you, but because he might be actually interfering with your privacy. I remember Alfredo Molano, a good friend, a very fine journalist, telling me how annoyed he was by having to be with this bodyguard all over the place all the time. And not only was he annoyed by the lack of privacy, but he even had to give this guy money for the gas of his car because the state agency that he worked for didn't pay for the gasoline. So there are all kinds of annoying and inconvenient situations, but it's a matter of life or death. So either you leave it or you take it. The other alternative, the only other alternative I can imagine is that the Journalist Association might create a security detail that is totally independent from the state, pay for it, and so on and so forth, but that does not exist at the present. Until there is an independent sort of security provided to journalists, again, I don't see a way out of this.
And it's interesting to see that the recent journalist killed in Colombia was from Buenaventura. He was threatened 9 months ago, had to live somewhere else. I think that he went to Medellin, went back after 9 months when the family thought he was okay, and he was killed right there in the second day he arrived to Buenaventura. And the family will probably sue him for lack of protection, by the way, which is an interesting point. Yes,
But
Lynn.
that's the point. I mean, when we send journalists into Latin America, I mean, even when I've gone to Latin America, I mean, our biggest concern is the government not being able to trust the government. Because if we're sending journalists into Venezuela, I mean, we are getting security that are not tied to the government because they may not like what we are reporting, and therefore, in addition to that, our journalists may be more in danger. So I think that I agree that there is a pragmatic part in the short term, but the reality is that when we say that, oh, well, we rely on the government to secure the safety of the citizens, these governments cannot secure the safety of the citizens. We see that even on, people that aren't even journalists, even our entertainment. We had Miss Universe killed, and she was an actress and no one knew she was there. She was killed because she was a regular person. So to me, it's not a question of whether the government can protect you. I don't think the government can protect you in Latin America unless you are serving a particular purpose that is convenient for them at a particular time. Otherwise, your safety is not guaranteed usually by these governments. And you're right, pragmatically, it is a cost issue. It's an economic. Can we continue to do independent journalism for the cost that it takes to do independent journalism in Latin America? Because we can sit here and talk about that, but unless the economics are there, we're not going to be able to protect the journalists adequately.
Yes, Sergio, and I would like to move, and then Emilio would like to move in the next topic because we have
And
an interesting agenda to cover.
2 seconds. In Colombia, once you are the target, forget it. I mean, if they decide to kill you, there's nothing to do. I mean, it's clear.
By the way, Ricardo, I look at you because I know you have much to say. I know that there are these alerts that we have been talking about, right? To try to create.
I just want to clarify that the different protection systems for journalists are part in Latin America, especially in Colombia, in Mexico right now, being input in Guatemala, are part of the evolution of the human rights movement. It's not just about journalists. What we had been fighting for, not to protect journalists, but to protect freedom of expression. It happens to be that journalists are professionally working on that issue. But for instance, we had been fighting in favor of stiffening penalties in the penal code of each country, making crimes like in Mexico, Brazil, or Argentina federal crimes, because we know and the poor credibility of the judiciary in different states of those countries. So there are a lot of issues involved, but it's not just about protecting journalists, it's about protecting freedom of expression. For instance, the penal code of Colombia doesn't mention just journalists when they talk about stiffening penalties. It's also about members of the unions, teachers, or anybody which is being killed or threatened because of their freedom of expression.
Emilio, you have something to say? And then after Emilio's comment, we'll move into another issue of federalizing not the crime of committed against journalists, but the so-called crimes committed by journalists, which is the issue of the defamation. Where are we in the issue of decriminalization of defamation? But Emilio, go ahead.
El presidente del Ecuador, Rafael Correa, me quiso condenar, hizo que me condenen a 3 años de cárcel.
Correa wanted me to condemn myself too because I insulted him. I do not want them to demand me because I insulted them in English. So I am going to talk in Spanish.
Exactly, criminal defamation. Very good. So tell me, Emilio, how was that?
Emilio, I'm working very hard in the language, but I think if you live in a country, you have to learn the language of the country. So excuse me because I'm still trying. I have 2 opinions. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but in one of the first illegal procedures, a threat appeared against my son, who was 5 years old at the time. An old journalist had told me that when they threaten you, don't say anything, but when they threaten your family, you have to make a lot of noise. That was a very good advice, and I followed it, and the government offered me protection. After thinking a lot about it, I denied to receive that protection because that meant that I would have to have behind me all day long a policeman following me and finding out everything that I was doing. And for me, it was very dangerous, like it was shown. I could not trust in the protection of the state. Afterwards, in another legal procedure that I was mentioning, that I was condemned to 3 years in jail, the building was full of soldiers, not policemen, but army with weapons. A multitude of people of the government outside surrounding the building, the sentence with shouts and insults. We all went down, and the lawyer said, let's go through this pathway, and I'm going to go to a street where there's not going to be body. The thing was dark. And then the multitude of the people of the government were there, and the lawyers had gone another way. So these people falls on top of me. I do not know what was going to happen to me. I do not know if you know that my trial was because I said that Rafael Correa had gone to a police place where he said that they were sequestered and they wanted to kill him, and I thought that was a lie, that the policeman never wanted to do that. Well, the policemen surrounded me, and the ones that defended me from that multitude at that moment were the policemen themselves, not due to an order that the authority had given them, because there's no policeman in Ecuador that doesn't know that Emilio Fagacio was the one that defended them. So I did not ask for their support then, but it worked. The help of the police helped. Excuse me, those 2 anecdotes to say the following. That's why I mentioned them. I think we should have to take into account 2 things. First, Latin America is a disease, is chronically diseased of a lot of defects. He's diseased with this. I do not know that this is what we're discussing. This is not a chronic disease we're discussing about. What we're discussing about is that within that chronic phenomenon that has decades or centuries perhaps, there's a very particular phenomenon that the violence now comes directly from the governments, not even from the state in general as a fraction, but of the president of the Republic, that make a list of journalists and they say we have to liquidate all these journalists. It's not the phenomenon of Mexico or Colombia or the history of the history of violence in the country. It's not just, it's the present. What they said before in the other room was right. Some, they had a list of journalists, and some had to ask for asylum here. But you have to recognize that the majority of them are from the left. We are defending ourselves. And with this, I conclude. We have to defend ourselves, not for the general violence and corruption, but of the violence ordered by certain presidents from Latin America that make a list with names of the journalists, so they want to destroy those journalists. It's not the disease, it's the emergency. I do not know if I explain myself well. There's a situation that I want to mention, and I am inviting my colleagues, my lawyer colleagues, to the reaction of this from the legal point of view. It is interesting that the governments, as Emilio is saying,
Los gobiernos are the one. Even though there is, at least from major public officials, starting with presidents and ministers, who the recent case I saw in Nicaragua was the army denouncing a journalist and defaming a journalist clearly and inviting the spying on the journalist because of the criticism against the administration. The point I want to make here is that look at this. If we look at the panorama, the defamation map, like Article 19, an organization, non-governmental organization well known of the Human Rights Monitors on Freedom of Expression says. There's a defamation map. They said there are good news from Costa Rica, good news that Mexico federalized the decriminalization of defamation in Mexico, although and DF, the Distrito Federal, has decriminalized, and I think that 3 or 4 states, but the majority of the states of Mexico still work under criminal defamation. So it's something that Mexico needs to resolve. Venezuela, on the other hand, instead of reducing and decriminalizing, they over-criminalize. Instead of 1 year or 18 months of sentence, they increase it to 4 years. And if it's slander or it's desacato, then it's from 6 months to, right? Claudia knows this very well because I'm sure she has been facing these things being closed in Colombia. Interesting countries like Uruguay, who has been presented today as one of the champions of freedom of expression, even by Claudio Paolillo, recently said in a webinar, and I agree with him, that one of the presidents that is defending the most freedom of expression today in the continent is José Pepe Mujica in Uruguay. And he's a former member of Tupamaro guerrilla movement and a very lefty government, by the way. But interestingly enough, no movement on the part of Mujica for decriminalizing defamation in Uruguay. So this is interesting, just to give you a little bit of the panorama on this. So the issue is, and I go back to Emilio, and I would like to see what Adolfo thinks and what Lynn thinks about this issue, as well as Victor. I know, and thank you, Emilio, for being gracious in discussing the case, your case. I have been reading in the internet that they say Emilio Palacio in the last sentence was too strong and could have used a different wording. When you said that President Correa was a president that had ordered to fire on innocent people in the hospital when he took when he was asylum in the situation, and that you said that he should be facing a criminal court, like we have many times said the same thing about the falsos positivos or disappeared people with President Uribe in Colombia, which is still unresolved, that situation. So what will be your reaction? And from the legal perspective, the wording is essential. In the defamation, we know that one of the elements of defamation are the words. We teach our students, Ricardo, we really teach our students, these are the 6 elements: identification, defamation, fault, harm, right? And the defamatory words are essential in defining that. So I'll give the word to Emilio. How would you respond to the criticism made to you online that you could have used different words and that you were in fact probably defaming, and that President Correa is entitled to have his reputation as a president, even if he's a president?
Mira, lo que tú estás preguntando es sumamente importante.
What you are saying is very important, and I hope that the universities will dedicate a lot of space to this, because it's a combined work of journalists and lawyers. I will try to be as clear as possible. I had to learn a lot about laws for this. We confronted to the following problem. You can adopt 2 lines of defense that are different when they accuse you of defaming somebody. What I said is true. What I said is true, and I'm going to prove it. And I proved it afterwards, not in the judgment, but afterwards. Among other things, I could not have been able to prove it in the trial because I wanted to present proofs, and the judge forbid me to present any proofs. And the lawyers, the desk of my lawyers was empty because the judge prohibited us, negated us to give pictures or anything, total indefensiveness. But a way of defend yourself, what I said is true. And afterwards, I presented the official document, the official report of the army of the 30th of September, what it says that the one that ordered to attack with 900 soldiers with war tanks, that unfortunately they didn't arrive because they took time in the trip. It was the president of the country. He was the one that ordered that operation. I do not, well, it's fantastic to tell you what Correa ordered for that day, and I presented the report of the police. Besides, I presented the report of the police, and the police says the 30th of September they had taken of the loyal police, because there's an area of the police that was loyal to the president, the 30th of September. We took the hospital, we took the control, and we told Mr. President, you are safe, you can leave. And the president said, I'm not leaving until the army doesn't arrive. Which Rafael Correa wanted is the participation of the army in the political life, for which he needed the justification of the intent of a coup. So I showed afterwards that my affirmation was correct, but my lawyer said you cannot arrive to the trial with my line of defense. And they said no, because what is being discussed here is your right to say something even when you are wrong. I do not know if I'm understood.
So pretty much that you were, even regardless if it's true or that you were not at fault.
Even if I would have been wrong, which I wasn't wrong, and I proved it with documents, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights has established, has set jurisprudence and said in agreements and treaties in the United Nations that it has been said the right of the journalist to say what their opinion is about public events and about officials of the government, even if they make a mistake. And even a judge of the Supreme Court of the United States said it, though he didn't get the majority of the votes, even if they lie.
Good to be internationalized, transnationalized, like the First Amendment? And remember, we had that discussion, Adolfo, some years ago.
What I find fascinating about the Ecuadorian case is just, I think it kind of shows what the need for decriminalizing defamation in Latin America, because it's selective enforcement. Essentially, it's for long historical reasons, defamation is wedded to the notion of honor. In Latin America, once you introduce that element, if you dishonor somebody, essentially you've committed a crime. And so the idea that nobody thinks of how does that reconcile with the freedom of expression, freedom of the press that's guaranteed in just about every single Latin American country's constitution, by a myriad of laws that exist throughout. What the reality is there's selective enforcement of these criminal laws. In many countries, it's been decades since any criminal action has been brought. Yet, when somebody wants to attack or control the press, it's a nice tool to go after them, to actually bring a criminal action against that party. And then based on that crime that exists within the books, you're able to initiate a civil claim for an absurd amount of money, based on the laws that either may, in some cases, provide a cap or a limit of how much you can recover or not. Obviously, in Ecuador, there was no limit, and a very I think it was 38 million, if I recall correctly, was the.
He asked $80 million.
$80 million.
And the court said only $40 million.
$40
And then
million.
in a magnanimous way, the president pardoned. El Universo. But by the way, how was 4 weeks ago, 2 journalists of El Universo had been convicted already for criminal defamation. And in Ecuador, they haven't been able to leave. They were found guilty, one, right? Guilty.
But
Now,
I think that's why it's so important that this project of decriminalizing defamation goes forward, because it's a real problem if we're going to have true freedom of the press, that a government, and governments change, that they can't just pull this out of the hat and attack saying it's perfectly legal.
and I tell you, this issue of decriminalization of the actual malice rules, for those of you who are not lawyers, is beyond the defense of truth. And I'm getting in trouble here. Beyond the defense of truth, one popular defense is to allege that there was no fault, regardless if you were truthful or not, accurate or not. And the reckless disregard, the actual malice is basically reckless disregard for the truth or knowing falsity. One of the two. If you're able to successfully allege one of those two, you will be safe, according to the New York Times versus Sullivan case of 1964. Now, don't think that the United States is free from the issue of defamation or criminal defamation, because the recent information is that there has been in Wisconsin, in Oklahoma, and I forgot the other state, I think it was Kansas, cases dealing with defamation, criminal defamation being undusted from the books against bloggers in the internet. And this is being denounced now by non-governmental organizations, including CPJ, Reporters Sans Frontières, and all of these people. And by the way, it's important to distinguish between defamation in the common law tradition with defamation in the Roman Germanic. In the common law tradition, the matter the defamation is made, written or verbal, is fundamental. In the Roman Germanic system of law, they don't care about the way the defamation is done. They care about the content of the defamation. If you accuse someone of a crime, that's calumny. If you accuse someone strongly but not of a crime, it's defamation. If you just are injurious or insulting, that's injuria. So there are big differences that we have to be very careful about translating, right, some legal system to the other, and we know this matters a lot legally. So what to do? And by the way, there is the desacato laws, which is insulting of public officials. And we have several governments, because of the campaigning since the Chapultepec Declaration in 1994, for countries to repeal desacato rules, and several of them have done it, although ambiguously. Chile, for example, repealed desacato, but retained the desacato rules in the military code. So in the civilian law it's not there, but in the military code it is. So some things that are complicated. So what to do about this issue, Victor? It's a complicated,
I don't have an
major
answer,
issue.
but I do have a question, and my question is, we know the press is powerful. It's been referred to as the fourth power. Burke referred to the press as the fourth power because it truly has an impact. We know about that, and that is why we consider it so valuable for the protection of democracy, among other things. But what do you do when a powerful journalist attributes you in a negligent way, in a reckless way, criminal behaviors that you are not responsible for, whether you are a state official or you are a private individual? If they tell you you are a rapist or you basically stole the money of the treasury and attributes you having an account in a foreign bank of so many $1 million and so on and so forth, what can you do to protect yourself when journalists, for reasons not having to do with freedom of expression, but because there might be an agenda of weakening your political movement or weakening you as an individual politician who probably has a good future in politics, what can you do to protect yourself?
Because the journalists, like Claudia said, there is militant journalism, and there are a lot of journalists out there that will be willing to destroy a politician just because it's part of the political agenda of himself, herself, or someone else. And we do have regulations that are very jealously protecting honor and reputation, because we know defamation is a historical exception to freedom of expression, recognized historically. Even in the United States, certainly when we passed the First Amendment, we knew that defamation there was a long history about defamation since in Europe. So, Victor, that's a very good point. A lawyer what do you think a lawyer will answer? He will say, I mean, this person is entitled to defend the reputation and should take this person to a court.
My only pragmatic answer is there has to be some type of even minimalist definition of a crime. You might not call it defamation, you might call it something else. You might not link it or might not want to link it to outdated notions such as honor, because I do believe that is an exaggeration, but there has to be some type of minimalist definition of criminal behaviors on the part of journalists, communicators, or any other individuals when they just overstep their boundaries. And again, you can be as liberal as you want with what the boundaries are, but there has to be at least a minimalist definition to protect your right to a name, your right to say your own name as a journalist. If it is attacked by someone who is attributing you receiving money from whoever in order to disseminate news, there has to be a way for you to protect yourself. So again, my only suggestion is I don't think I am totally in favor of eliminating defamation across the board. There has to be a minimalist definition of defamation that is necessary for the protection of civil rights, and the right to a good name is a civil right. It's not a fundamental right, but it's a civil right.
So, Victor, before going to Emilio and Sergio, hold on a second. This is the lawyers talking, like very well Emilio said. It's good to sit down these lawyers and journalists together. Now the lawyers talking here are saying, right, Lynn, what do you have in mind?
Well, I would disagree. I'm sorry.
Oh.
And I understand.
We do that too, lawyers.
I understand I'm an American lawyer and Latin American trained as well, but my concern is we're talking about your reputation. We're not talking about physical harm. So you don't have to equate protecting someone's reputation with putting someone in jail, which is a physical harm.
No, I'm not talking about jail.
But that's what we're talking about when we're saying criminalizing defamation. So, just like with the First Amendment, yes, we do recognize, and it is that balancing of the First Amendment with your rights to freedom of speech. And defamation is not perfect, and in Latin America, there are more than enough ways to protect your reputation. The problem here is that we are stepping over and using criminal defamation in order to justify political agendas, or depending on which president or which government is there. There are laws in the United States that still have criminal libel on there, and they're archaic laws. And when they come up, the journalists do fight them in the United States because, again, they are used for purposes other than protecting your name. Because if what you're doing is combating a defamatory statement by the press, and in Latin America there are many press that have agendas, but that's why you need to protect that freedom of speech, because if the rest of the press didn't have an agenda and wasn't paid by the governments, then you would have that freedom of expression, and you would allow the journalists to allow the people to see for themselves what is the actual true issues and what is the actual journalism. And that's why, in my opinion, criminal defamation isn't the solution just to protect yourself in Latin America.
So, Mayra, I'm thinking about you because you're next in the next topic after Emilio and Sergio. Because we're talking about, Stephanie, I know you know about this, and Emily, you feel very strongly about it as well. I know you have been remained quiet listening, but sometimes that's a good approach. Of course, Ferreira is talking too much here, probably. Mayra, about Peru and the issue of anti-monopoly laws and the issue of El Comercio that you know very well, and you're covering as a reporter, by the way. So, Emilio, any reaction, and Sergio, about this issue? So, for the time being, we kind of close it?
Just a question. What happened in the United States with character assassination? I mean, it's in political exercise, you have a tool, character assassination, to destroy a candidate or your opponent in a very ugly way. So what happened here that's not the same thing that happened in Latin America, for instance. So it's a question.
Oh,
I mean, as far as sanctions are concerned, I think that there's always a sanction that's available, which is, at least in the U.S., you would bring a civil claim, civil liability. But I think that there's got to be one key element that people often forget. You might say something horrible about somebody, but if they didn't suffer any damages as a result of that statement, which may have been false, then why should that person be awarded damages? In many, many cases, you have things that are said about individuals that turn out to be incorrect, false. If the person who it was of and concerning, what the individual that or company that was harmed, then they shouldn't be able to recover. So, for example, I might say that Aquafina tastes terrible, and I think I'm protected as an individual to express my opinion on this. And because it's opinion, I think I'm in decent ground. If I say this is poisonous, then you start getting into a dangerous area, and Aquafina probably is not going to like the fact that I say that Aquafina is poisonous. If it's not what's called hyperbole, meaning it's not just, it's clearly, I was just, speaking in a, outrageous way, but it's clear that I was trying to create a situation for Aquafina. I knew that this was false, or I did it with what's called actual malice, then they may bring a lawsuit against me. They're going to have to show that they lost sales or that their brand somehow was harmed. And I think that that's the part where oftentimes I see people all the time, they want to sue, so-and-so said something bad about me, but did you lose your job? Did something else happen? There's always the emotional harm that probably occurs, assuming that what was said was incorrect. The emotional damage that comes from, somebody maybe saying something about your person, that calling you a liar, something to that effect that does harm, maybe provide some psychological effect. But that's harder to prove, and you're going to have to make a showing.
Feel better, Sergio? So
You have not Aquafina, but a Congress candidate here and other Congress candidate here, and so said, well, you are a corrupt person because you did a lot of ugly things when you were in office, and nothing happened. I mean, it's great. It's great. It's a negative advertising in the political arena, but it's protected by the First Amendment, I think.
Well, and that's the basis of political speech. That's the basis of looking into our public officials. And if they are wrong and you are doing it on purpose, then there are consequences to pay. But the consequences are civil. You don't put someone in jail either because they got it wrong or because they did it on purpose. If they did it on purpose, you're hurting them where it hurts more. They're not going to have the money to be able to do it again.
There's also a policy of allowing politicians to say whatever they want, because it does have a chilling effect if you start accusing somebody of engaging in either a criminal defamation or even a civil lawsuit. It's very difficult for candidates, political candidates, to maintain an action. They do from time to time. When a newspaper runs a story saying that they did something back in their past, they can bring that action. But it's in the course of a political campaign, there are greater protections that are, you become essentially a public person, and you have to overcome a higher threshold to succeed.
Well, I need to move on then, and I would like to engage our three students. Long time, thank you for waiting for me patiently. Mayra, could you tell us a little bit about this issue that you're covering with El Comercio, Grupo El Comercio in Peru, who did what, Mayra? If you can tell us a little bit and what you think about it.
Okay. Bueno, el periódico.
Well, journalism in Peru is going through a stage that is quite special. It comes from the Fujimori administration in the 90s, in which it was discovered after his administration that many of the media companies, the journalists and the journals and the channels, they were bought by the government in many of the trials that but videos were shown for him and his successor. But then happened what has happened now after they were all bought, and then with the Toledo government, the freedom of the press returned. Now most of the media concentrated in the commerce with almost 80% of the media in their power, both channels and journals and newspapers. So those two things are questioned. First is how much will there be freedom of expression, and how objective will be the information that is presented now when all are concentrated in a single point of view. And the other is that those who are in favor of what is happening now is that they say if the government for a long time manipulated the media, the only way to now counteract or to be opponents of the government is by having most of the media, a majority of the media, and those are the points that are in contradiction in Peru right now. And Emily? Yo creo que algo ocurre semejante en Venezuela con varias personas que están afiliados con opinión, tienen varios medios.
Cadena Capriles, which is one of the biggest conglomerates of media in the nation, right? So on March 16, a couple of weeks ago, the director of Cadena Capriles, David de Lima, who's a politician associated with the government, basically ordered top-down to take out one of the articles that was going to be published about the Guarimbas and the situation that's going on. After this happened, it was an article by Laura Weffer, who's an investigative journalist that's very, very serious in her work. Tamoa Calzadilla, que es la jefa de información, or was la jefa de información, she resigned from this because there's this issue of self-censorship that's really, really pervasive in the Venezuelan.
Because this issue of
how the media is being bought by the governments with a certain agenda to pursue several objectives. So, for instance, in the early 2000s, the Venezuelan government, they basically said, we need a communicational hegemony to be able to control and promote the socialism of the 21st century. And this is something that has been going on for many, many years in Venezuela, like we have heard in the previous panel, but that is very pervasive, that's still going on today. And with regards to the criminalization, as you said before, Venezuela is, instead of decreasing criminalization, it's increasing the criminalization of defamation. So if a journalist is critical of the government and a journalist tries to put out allegations of corruption or anything, even if they do have the proof and they find an outlet, whether it's digital or printed, to put that information out there, they are going to be persecuted systematically by the government. That's something that's been going on in the past few years, right? So this is an issue that's not only going on in Venezuela, but across the region, that I think it's very damaging, not only for the media, but also politically for everybody.
Actually, Emily, I will say that right now, after violence, which is the old topic, the most important concern today in the region, one of the primary concerns, as I see it in the experience of, and especially with media owners, is this issue of monopoly regulation and antitrust, which, by the way, is in most of the constitutions of Latin America. Most of them have regulation constitutionally, constitutional clauses talking about the obligation of the state to fight monopolization. And sometimes becomes like a matter of family debate. The Vargas Llosa family, for example, Mario Vargas Llosa said that it sounds a terrible idea that the Grupo El Comercio bought Pensa and they have 80% control or controlling interest of the daily press in Peru. And Álvaro Vargas Llosa said, I don't see any problem in the end, because the relevant market in Peru is not just the daily newspapers, like it had been mentioned. There's a wider competition with the internet, and when you measure that, the percentage of control of the media really is a lot negligible. And when you have issues of sustainability, particularly with the internet, then you need sources of revenue from diverse sources of revenue. And if you limit the market, then what you're doing is just further struggling the press. So not an easy issue. Stephanie, you have, in Venezuela, what is your reaction about that? And then.
Well, I'm familiar with the topic in Venezuela, but what they're also trying to do when they try to create those monopolies, they're trying to fight what's going on right now in social media. Mm-hmm. The issues that have been going in Venezuela right now have been trying to, the journalists, they try to speak about it, but since the government is shutting it down, they use social media for that. So I feel that sometimes they try to control the media by creating these monopolies. But as a journalist, how am I going to fight that monopoly in my own country?
And some journalists will say, you know what, I'm going to engage in the internet, going into social networks.
And I'll become
or
an independent
community
journalist,
exactly.
and everybody will know about it.
Or community media. And the government of Venezuela, actually, particularly during the Chavez times, he was saying, I'm very proud that now community media is thriving in Venezuela, which, by the way, has been recognized as a step forward in Venezuela because more people are engaged in community media with government funding. That's the issue, right? So, in other words, it's good that thanks to fighting monopoly, we have more space for frequencies for community media and for the internet. So.
But even with the social media that's going on, we also find these countries too, they're looking for ways to decrease internet and the usage for people to gain access to the social media. So in essence, even though they buy entire conglomerates in their whole states, they still hold the power in their own country, because if you shut down internet, you're still going to have power to control your country with your own information that you want to address to
Emilio, and then Lynn, I know that you have.
Sí, yo creo que estamos hablando de dos problemas que.
I think we are talking about two problems that are linked. The excess in the use of freedom of the press. When you slander and you defame, it can cause moral damage, but also physical damage. You can lose your job, you can get sick, you can die, your children can emigrate. It's unbelievable what a slander can do to human being. And the monopolic control with media is not that nothing happened. It's a big problem. So the discussion is that the solution is not the government. That's the point. The solution is not to put that person in jail, because you don't fix anything doing that. The solution is not the solution that you can have this media and you cannot have this other media because I decide that as president. But the thing is that these problems are new in society. Let's not forget, because freedom of expression is not that it is one. It was not earned with the First Amendment. With the First Amendment, there were many years during which slander was a crime in the United States. You went to jail in spite of the First Amendment. It's very recent when the freedom of expression became so ample, and then this problem started to come up. And with this, I want to finish. We haven't found yet the solution. I think the solution goes through the observatories of media, the universities, the civil society. I have to start organizing. So the day that you see me insulting somebody with, or not rightly, FIU, have the civil society to have me scratched as a miserable journalist. You attack people basically. So they take out my freedom of expression against the freedom of expression. We have to find new solutions. And may I say that in the United States, we are talking a lot about Latin America. In the United States, as was said very well by my colleague, the problem is extremely grave. How can you destroy a candidate because he was unfaithful to his wife? What do I care in his private life? What I want to know whether he's a good president or not, and nobody stands up and says what you are doing, Mr. Journalist, is wrong. I don't think the government has to do that.
Of society and civil society is fundamental in order to dynamize the freedoms and materialize them and strengthen the freedoms, all freedoms of communication. But if you look from policy perspective and from the government perspective and from many sectors of the society who disagree with concentration of power and further concentration of conventional media power in different areas, they're saying we need a solution. And remember, this is it is a new problem implemented, but it's not that new. Remember, the Sherman Act of the United States was passed in 1890, over a century ago. So the legal solution is what? We have many solutions here. Remember, we divested AT&T in 1980s in telecommunications. We have divested the film industry. We divested the broadcasting industry. ABC was the result of that divestiture. In other words, broken up monopolies. So what do you think? From the legal issue, what is the solution?
The one thing I just want to mention, because I think it's an important point on a key difference. We talk about, I get concerned that we're speaking as if like the U.S. is perfect and everything is good. The fact is that Latin Americans consume much more media, be it newspapers, radio, television, and internet, than do most U.S. citizens. You know, from, you know, since you go to the most remote rural area and you'll find an illiterate farmer listening to a radio or having a television set. And that was access. And the need perhaps for controlling monopolies is greater in Latin America, but then you need to ask, has the technology revolution altered the terrain and made it less necessary? The fact that people now have access through the World Wide Web to all kinds of different media. You look at what's happened in Brazil and the amount of usage of social media in Venezuela to the extent that they don't interfere with social media. And it's amazing. I mean, it's such an important new development, and I'm just throwing it out there as, you know, maybe it's not so important anymore based on the development of these new delivery platforms.
So more choices, right, Emily? In the end, why are we so concerned about a monopoly?
Yeah, that's a very important development, but there's also something that we need to consider is that the tentacles of the Venezuelan government also finds its way to a social media. They have like communicational guerrillas like sitting on the computer tweeting and trying to generate this communication hegemony within the social media itself. So yeah, Venezuela is one of the countries that has like the most consumers of social media, especially in Latin America and the region. But then also, the pervasiveness of the government and the governmental agenda also goes beyond not only the media and how they buy Global Vision or they buy all of those stuff, but they also try to make a presence on the online communication. So the battle goes to that area as well. There's a lot of polarization in the country, and you see that a lot of Twitter accounts fighting back and forth all the time when you start tracking all of those social media developments, right? You have like people from the government, like sometimes I post like pictures or something, you have people from the government attacking you because you post a picture, you know, like you also have those very big issues in the social media. Now the question is whether the communication revolution, the social media is going to generate an alternative public sphere where people can have dialogue and discourse. Now that's a question that I'm kind of interested in for my own research, but later on that we can see. So, and with this I want to close very quickly. Some of the stats about social media that were conducted by the data survey about what's going on in the country since February 12th, right? So for instance, they asked the question, how have you kept informed about the developments in Venezuela? 45% of people said, well, TV through open signal. So those and that's controlled by the government. 41% said social media. That's a very important number, because when you compare with the number of people who get informed by the print, it's 20%. So more people get informed by social media today than by printed journalism. So that can change the panorama of journalism in the long run, but we're still like in the opening stages of how this is going to play out in the long run.
And what do you think about the quality of journalists in the social network? Because when I went to Chile and they were in the student protest, one of the bloggers came, very good actually, and he was a speaker in one of the panels, interesting. And he said, you know what, I don't give a damn about order. I just want to express myself. And don't give me all of those rules of ethics and all of those rules of law. I just want to express myself and no one is going to stop me. Right? So, and you can have a lot of bloggers and communicators out there that have that. And by the way, he was very good, funded by the Knight Foundation at one point, right? Because he's so active in the community, he's doing really interesting work in community activism. And don't call me citizen journalist. I'm not a citizen journalist. Don't give me these labels. I'm just an activist in the social media, the only media in which we can talk freely. What do you think about this kind of thing that I know you can relate to it, in the sense of are they journalists? And we have issues of liability, sustainability in the internet. Are we talking really about journalism there?
Bueno, yo creo que social media, para el caso de Venezuela en particular,
case of Venezuela in particular, it has been very helpful to show to the world what is happening I have a couple of friends that live in Venezuela, and they would send me videos and links and videos of what was happening. When I went to the links had disappeared already, but they can send me the videos. So in particular case of Venezuela and other countries, the social media can help so that the world knows what's happening. On the other hand, as you mentioned, in reality, since they are not journalists, are just citizens, they can commit some mistakes. Nevertheless, I value very much this social media because in the particular case of Latin America, it can help to show the world what is happening, that the government many times intervenes and doesn't let the world know what's happening.
Lynn. And Tom, maybe you know this legally. They are becoming more liable. The internet, countries in Latin America, especially in South America, are suing the internet companies. Google, Yahoo has been in the courts, right? And they're losing. Sometimes win, sometimes they lose. And because of the liability of the contents they carry, right? And by the way, important to talk about the emerging and defined regulation of the internet. And this is added up to the issue that more netizens or journalists in the internet are being killed. By the way, they're counted, and I think that 3 of them have been killed in the last 3 years already. So it's, most definitely, we're moving into more traditional, from the traditional media, living with the traditional media, but also engaging in the new media. And I would like to explore a little bit about the legal and the ethical implications of that. So Mayra, Stephanie, you have your own blog too, right?
Well, no, I don't have my own blog, but I do think with social media and going back to what they were saying in reference to Venezuela and to the monopoly that we were talking about earlier, I feel sometimes that regular citizens feel the need to express what's going on in the world because of these monopolies, because the monopolies are not going to shed light to what's going on in the cities or in Congress or anywhere else. But I do also feel that with these monopolies, they will reduce the internet to the citizens, therefore social media in some countries might cease, and we will not be able to any longer see any publications or any pictures from people from Venezuela or what's happening or any part of the world. So I think that's going to be a big issue later on. These countries minimizing the internet usage for their citizens and us not being able to know what's happening in that country.
Many things for Emilio in his head. And by the way, if anyone wants to ask a question in the audience, please join in. We can do that in the next 15 minutes before we finish. Victor, you have it?
I am intrigued by the fact that in the past, professions were regulated and people were required to follow certain standards of professional behavior. That happened with virtually all professional groups, engineers, attorneys, medical doctors, journalists, when it became a profession, were also held to certain standards. Nowadays, evidently what is happening is that anybody can make use of the social media and there are no professional standards they can be held to because they are not members of a licensed board of some kind, because they haven't been necessarily trained to follow particular standards. They are just citizens speaking in public. And this is free speech, and it's really hard to regulate free speech. On this, I am liberal. On this one, I am very liberal. I think it's very hard to restrict free speech. I don't think free speech can be restricted, and therefore I think these are just beyond regulation. They cannot be regulated. At least
so unregulated
again,
internet.
We are talking about citizens
right?
speaking, not institutions making use of the internet or social media to project or disseminate particular information. I'm talking this time about individuals.
Individuals. Emilio, you cannot regulate communications. You cannot put standards to this theater. You have to, let's say, 10 actors or 2 actors. You cannot put limits to the theater. You cannot put limits to the paintings. you cannot paint by the size of the canvas or the colors. You can use the painter has to paint whatever he wants, but in all the courts of the world, the justice courts, they say that the freedom of expression is totally free. They have a privacy, defamation, and slander, things like that. Those are limits that they had always have. That's the same with the Surveillance Act. Majority of countries have copied to supervise their citizens and their journalists. So how do you say that the freedom is not absolute? Let me continue and finish with this. What I do believe.
Genera un problema muy grande, que es el poder de los medios de comunicación. Yo he combatido al gobierno del Ecuador por atacar la libertad de expresión, pero durante toda mi trayectoria periodística yo combatí el poder de los medios de comunicación. Lo que yo sostengo es que el poder de los medios de comunicación no se combate con el Estado, porque tampoco somos los ciudadanos, se lo combate con la organización de los ciudadanos. No es suficiente Internet, porque Internet es tú solo tuiteando, y ¿qué le haces tú al New York Times o a NBC con un tuit? No le haces nada. Hay que formar organizaciones de ciudadanos, observatorios de los medios de comunicación que empiecen a opinar no de lo que pasa en el país, sino de lo que hacen los medios de comunicación. Yo quiero que a mí un observatorio de medios de comunicación me diga cómo estoy haciendo mi trabajo y alguien le dé la plataforma para que puedan escucharlo. Y no tengo ningún problema en que me digan lo que me quieran decir, porque creo en lo que yo hago, confío en mi trabajo y estoy dispuesto a enfrentarme con cualquiera. Lo que no tienen los ciudadanos de a pie que no están de acuerdo con mi trabajo, es alguien que les permita decirle con voz suficientemente fuerte: Emilio Palacio es un mentiroso por tal y tal razón. Me encantaría que lo puedan decir. No quiero que Rafael Correa me meta preso. Lo que quiero es que los ciudadanos que no estén de acuerdo con mi trabajo me lo digan en la cara y crear los organismos para eso. Esto es algo nuevo, no existe. Estoy proponiendo una cosa que no existe ante un problema que se nos ha estado presentando en la realidad, y creo que las universidades tienen un papel que cumplir en ese sentido.
Sergio, ¿tú querías decir algo? ¿Sí? Y si hay alguna pregunta, podemos tener 2 preguntas y gracias, Tony.
Thank you. Para mí,
another source of information. I don't think it's a professional or otherwise. I think it's a source, and it's a very valuable source. But we have to be aware that there are a lot of fabricated facts, images, editing videos. It's the case of Venezuela. There are a lot of things that you can trust of. So I think it's a excellent source of information. You can see trends. You can see what people are thinking about, facts or events, but not, the source. It's my point.
Yeah, Adolfo.
I do think there's a distinction between professional journalists and a citizen who's a blogger. And it's hard to define, but I think that there should be ethical standards that apply to professional journalists. I think that there are protections that are specifically designed to be used by journalists and not necessarily just by any single person. I think that there's a lot that could be done by professional associations. Clearly the problem is licensing. There is no license, nor perhaps there shouldn't be. But there should be, I think, some recognition, some certification, and if somebody holds themselves out to be a professional journalist, they should be held to a certain standard and also enjoy certain protections that I think are a product of freedom of the press and international conventions and human rights.
Claudia, you have a question?
Great part of the panelists answered, but I think it's very interesting what you're saying specifically of the work on social networks and the professional journalism. In the definite case of Venezuela, coverage is so limited, the social networks and the journalist in the field and the citizen is being very important supplier of visual information for the journalists, but it's also important not to lose in sight what is the professional journalist that has to process that information, because it lends itself to a lot of errors and suspicion, even for the government of Venezuela. Said that it was badly intentioned. There's a video that I can leave you, and perhaps you can use for your teaching, very interesting in how, from those videos that the people themselves in the place put them in the social networks and share it from the point of view of the professional journalist in the place. We saw who made that video, and we check if that is a person and the family people of that video, if it's true, and then we do a job to send it to the public again and processed also. And it's a difference between a spontaneous video and a processed video from the journalist's point of view, with all the seriousness. Cases of a mother whose son was on the street and nobody helped until 2 hours later, when he was taken to a health center, a man that ran, and 2 hours later he was found dead. And how was that search? And when they found in the hospital what they found in that hospital, it's very valuable at present in that democratic crisis, the help of the citizens' journalism. But if it has a process of the professional journalist, I wanted to know what the opinion was, but I heard some opinions already.
Sí, gracias. Y yo sé que Frank.
Thank you very much, and I know that Frank is sitting there and he's telling me finish quickly, because I know that the hours and the schedule is basic. Talking with freedom of expression. Well, Jack raised his hand, and I want to tell you, talking with Claudia in a minute, it's a topic of Rosenthal in the Journalism Center, and a lot before, and see that difference in the ethical and legal preparation, and reivindicates a bit of what this panel is doing. La diferencia.
Necessary citizen communicator, ordinary communicator, is the ethical and legal understanding of what they're doing. But we'll see if that holds.
Yeah, I just wanted
Jack.
to mention, referring to what Victor said, that anybody can be a journalist. And there have been attempts in various countries. Venezuela is a good one, Costa Rica, Cuba now, where there are colleges of journalists. But the negative side is that they tend to license journalists, and that's what's happening in Cuba now. Cuba, you can't be a journalist unless you've gone to a journalism school, and you can't go to a journalism school because it's the Communist Party that selects the students.
Yeah. So, Emily, you close for us?
Yeah, something that it's really important when taking into consideration what we have been talking about is where is the source of that information, right? Because sometimes, and I have seen this in the Venezuela case that I have been doing kind of research about this, I have seen pictures that were taken years ago, or pictures that were taken from Syria, or pictures from several other places, and videos being produced or from Colombia or like any other places that are being distributed as if it was happening in Venezuela right now. So, and that has happened like several ways. Either people viralize those contents, like they click retweet without legitimizing the source, or it's also like government agencies or government agents within the social media trying to promote desinformation, right? To kind of keep people in the dark and like keep people kind of shocked, like, oh my God, look at what's going on in that protest over there, and kind of try to keep people away from engaging into these things. So I think that one of the takeaways is, with regards to social media, is the question of how do we, as either journalists or scholars, legitimize the information that is being produced in a country where we have like several limitations on freedom of expression, on monopolies, like all these things. How do we legitimize the information that's coming from those countries, not only to produce serious journalism, but also serious scholarship, and produce like real knowledge about the situation that are happening in this country. So.
Thank you, Emily. So I want to thank all the Roundtable participants. Truly, thank you very much for coming. To all the participants, and then Frank, thank you for your patience.